It all started on one of those rare magical winter mornings when the world seemed to pause under a soft blanket of freshly fallen snow. The kind of snow that makes everything quieter, cleaner, and somehow more alive. And I stepped outside with a cup of steaming coffee, breathing in the crisp air, feeling the kind of calm you rarely get in a busy neighborhood. And I noticed the possibilities for fun, for joy, for something small yet monumental in the middle of a frozen world. Because I decided, right then and there, that I would build the biggest, happiest snowman this street had ever seen, rolling the first massive snowball across my driveway, letting it pick up layers of glistening snow, feeling the cold stick to my gloves as I sculpted, then stacking the second and third snowballs with careful precision, forming a towering figure that seemed to smile in the morning sun. And I dressed it with a bright scarf, a hat I borrowed from the garage, carefully placing a carrot nose, and giving it eyes that sparkled like little pieces of mischief, all while laughing at how absurd it felt to be this invested in a snowman as an adult. And the neighbors walking their dogs paused to admire it. Some children ran up to touch its soft snow, their giggles echoing down the street, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the neighborhood's energy shift from mundane routine to a shared moment of innocent joy, which, unfortunately, is exactly when I noticed Karen, our HOA chairperson, approaching with her usual posture of authority, heels crunching against the snow, sunglasses perched on her perfectly styled hair as if she had been waiting for the exact moment to unleash her judgment, clipboard in hand, giving me a look that could have frozen the air even harder than the snow around us. And she started speaking immediately, her voice sharp, rehearsed, dripping with that kind of fake concern only someone obsessed with rules can muster. And she said, "Is that yours?" And I answered yes, trying to keep my tone calm because I knew arguing with her would be futile, but she didn't care about reason, only about control, and immediately launched into her usual litany about how yard displays must be approved, seasonal decorations registered, and that the snow structure violated some abstract notion of neighborhood uniformity. And I couldn't help but stifle a laugh because it was ridiculous. Snow melts, it blocks nothing. And yet she was shaking with barely contained fury, her lips pressed tight, eyes narrowed like she had just discovered a crime against humanity. And I realized in that moment that her happiness did not exist, only the satisfaction of power, and I gently told her no, that the snowman would stay because it was harmless and brought joy, and I saw for the first time the volcanic rage behind her perfect exterior, the kind of anger that builds when someone refuses to obey. And as she stomped away, muttering about violations and the community standards, I couldn't have predicted that this small, innocent snowman was about to become the center of a story that would consume the entire neighborhood. A story of ego, revenge, strategy, and unexpected justice. Because that day, without even realizing it, I planted the seeds for an unforgettable lesson. One that would involve engines revving, metal colliding with snow, and a clever secret that Karen would never see coming. And as I looked at the snowman, its scarf fluttering in the wind, I felt a quiet determination settle in me, realizing that sometimes, the simplest acts of joy can trigger the biggest waves of consequences, especially when they collide with someone who believes rules exist only to enforce their superiority. And with that thought lingering, I went inside to warm up, unaware that within hours, my snowman would be destroyed, my patience tested, and my creativity challenged in ways that would make the neighborhood gossip for weeks. Because little did Karen know, she had just set in motion a chain of events that she would deeply regret. And as I sipped my coffee, staring out the frosty window at my creation, I felt the quiet thrill of anticipation, the calm before the storm, not knowing exactly what would happen next, but feeling certain that it would be unforgettable. Later that afternoon, the calm I had felt vanished the moment I heard a distant but unmistakable sound that made my stomach drop like a stone in icy water. The engine of a car revving far too aggressively, the kind of sound that announces trouble before you even see it, and I stepped outside just in time to see Karen, our neighborhood's self-proclaimed ruler, sitting in her massive SUV, her perfectly styled hair untouched by the wind, sunglasses reflecting the winter sun as she stared directly at my snowman with a mix of fury and satisfaction that made my blood boil, and without hesitation, she pressed the accelerator to the floor, that smug smirk spreading across her face as if she believed she was about to teach me a lesson for daring to bring joy into her carefully curated world. And before I could react, the SUV lurched forward like a predator closing in on prey, snow exploding in every direction, white flakes and chunks of ice spraying across the driveway, and I watched in disbelief as the snowman I had spent hours building, the one that had brought laughter, warmth, and fleeting happiness to the street, shattered into pieces, its carrot nose flying through the air, scarf tangled in a mess of snow, and its head rolling across the yard like some tragic comedy prop, and neighbors began appearing on their porches and in the windows, their expressions a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief, while children's laughter turned into cries, and I just stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to scream, run, or simply stare, because I had never seen such audacity in my life. Someone deliberately destroying another person's work, their joy, without any provocation except their own inflated sense of authority. And when Karen finally stopped, she didn't even glance at the mess she had made, didn't apologize, didn't hesitate, just revved her engine once more and drove off as if she had accomplished a heroic feat, leaving behind a trail of tire tracks across my driveway and a destroyed snowman that now felt like a metaphor for everything wrong with entitlement and abuse of power. And as I stood there, fists clenched, a mix of anger and disbelief coursing through me, I realized something important. This wasn't just about a snowman, it was about boundaries, respect, and the fact that for too long, people like Karen get away with treating everyone else like they are invisible. And in that moment, as the last chunks of snow melted under the pressure of reality, I decided that I wouldn't let this slide, that I wasn't going to cry, argue, or beg, but instead, I would respond in a way she never expected, a way that would protect my joy, teach a lesson, and perhaps even reveal the absurdity of her arrogance to the entire neighborhood. And the idea formed in my mind slowly at first, like the first tendrils of smoke rising from a fire, that I could rebuild the snowman, yes, but this time I could. Do it differently, smarter, secretly, in a way that would turn her own ego against her, because the moment someone like Karen feels invincible is exactly the moment they are most vulnerable. And as I went back inside to warm up, plotting quietly, thinking about what resources I had at hand, my eyes landed on the decorative post that had been delivered earlier in the week, a sturdy, heavy piece of wood that I had planned to install in spring but hadn't gotten around to. And suddenly, a plan took shape in my mind so perfectly absurd that it almost made me laugh. The kind of plan that was clever, non-violent, and completely justified, because if she thought she could destroy my joy with reckless force, then perhaps she was about to learn that patience, preparation, and a little creativity could turn the tables in a way she would never anticipate. And as I imagined her returning, revving her engine once more, expecting to flatten a harmless snowman, and instead encountering something solid, immovable, a mix of snow and cunning engineering, I felt a thrill of anticipation, the kind of excitement that comes from knowing you are about to witness karma unfold in real time. And so I began gathering materials, setting the foundation for the new snowman, thinking carefully about each detail, ensuring that it looked innocent, cheerful, completely ordinary to anyone passing by, while underneath, it contained a hidden strength, a surprise, a subtle but unshakable statement that no amount of entitlement could destroy what I had built. And as I worked, the neighborhood seemed to sense something had changed, as if the snow itself whispered promises of poetic justice, while I carefully sculpted, packed, and layered, imagining Karen's smug expression turning to shock, imagining the inevitable moment when her arrogance would meet reality. And in that quiet, snowy afternoon, I realized that this wasn't just a snowman, this was a plan, a message, a turning point, and by the time the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the icy street, the new snowman stood tall and proud, its scarf fluttering in the wind, carrot nose perfectly placed, eyes twinkling with innocence, and underneath it all, buried just beneath the fluffy white exterior, lay the secret that would make Karen's next attempt disastrous. And I stepped back, breathing hard, feeling the weight of anticipation and satisfaction settling in, knowing that the next time she revved her engine and floored the accelerator, the story of her arrogance colliding with clever planning would finally unfold, and I couldn't wait to witness it. The next morning, I awoke to an uneasy calm that seemed almost too quiet, the kind of silence that precedes a storm, and as I stepped outside with cautious optimism, the snow glinting under the pale winter sun, I could already sense that Karen had noticed the rebuilt snowman, because within minutes, the unmistakable roar of her engine echoed down the street, a sound I had come to recognize as the prelude to chaos, and there she was, sitting in her massive SUV, sunglasses reflecting the snow, like mirrors of arrogance, perfectly coiffed hair untouched by the biting wind, her hands gripping the wheel as if it were an extension of her sense of entitlement. And I could see the fury in her eyes even from across the street, the same fury that had destroyed my first creation. But this time, there was a subtle hesitation, a flicker of doubt that perhaps she hadn't anticipated, because the snowman, standing tall and cheerful, looked innocent, ordinary, just like any other winter decoration. And yet, beneath its snowy surface, it contained the clever, unmovable secret I had installed with meticulous care. And I couldn't help but smile faintly as I watched her rev the engine, her foot pressing the accelerator like a predator, determined to assert her dominance once again. Expecting an easy victory, expecting me to shrink, expecting the satisfaction of seeing her power confirmed, and the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Neighbors peeking from behind curtains, some with cameras already raised, some whispering to each other in disbelief, as if they too sensed that this time, something extraordinary was about to unfold. And as Karen drove forward, the SUV picking up speed, her smirk widening in anticipation of destruction, I felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension, knowing that the moment of truth was imminent, because her arrogance had led her to believe that snow, soft and fleeting, was all she needed to conquer, never realizing that, under the fluffy exterior, lay a foundation she could not move, could not crush, could not intimidate, and the impact, when it came, was nothing like the first time, because instead of snow exploding in a harmless mess, there was a jarring, violent collision that made her entire body lurch forward, the hood of her SUV crumpling against the solid, unyielding core beneath the snowman, a sound so loud it echoed down the street like a thunderclap, and for the first time, her smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unfiltered horror. And I stood there frozen for a moment, heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins, as I realized the plan had worked perfectly. The invisible trap that I had laid so carefully had transformed an act of petty aggression into a moment of undeniable justice, and the neighborhood erupted in murmurs and gasps, some children squealing in delight at the absurdity of seeing Karen's reaction, some adults shaking their heads in awe, and as she jumped out of the car, shouting, flailing, demanding to know what had happened, the full weight of her arrogance crashing down upon her, I could only watch silently, savoring the poetic symmetry of the moment, because she had floored her car into a snowman once, destroying joy without consequence, but now, the same action had consequences she could never have predicted, and as her voice grew louder, accusing me of placing dangerous objects in my yard, demanding police, shouting about lawsuits and hazards, I realized that her carefully constructed world of control and superiority was crumbling in real time, while the neighbors, emboldened by the spectacle, stepped forward, recounting her actions from the previous day, how she had targeted the snowman intentionally, how she had driven recklessly, and for the first time, Karen's authority held no weight, because the truth was evident, undeniable, visible to anyone who cared to see. And as she fumbled through excuses, flustered, red-faced, desperate to regain control, I felt a calm satisfaction settle over me, knowing that patience, preparation, and a little creativity had turned the tables completely. And when the police finally arrived, calm and professional, surveying the scene, listening to both sides, the absurdity of her claims became painfully clear, because she had deliberately caused property damage, she had acted recklessly, and she had underestimated the quiet, patient person she sought to intimidate. And as the officer issued citations for reckless driving and creating a hazardous situation, Karen's face fell. Her confidence shattered like the snowman she had tried to destroy, and in that moment, the street itself seemed to exhale, neighbors whispering, phones recording, and I realized that this small, seemingly insignificant snowman had become a catalyst for change, a symbol of clever justice, patience, and quiet strength, because Karen's arrogance had blinded her to the simplest truth, that destroying joy doesn't make you powerful, it makes you vulnerable, and that sometimes, the quietest, most calculated resistance can be more effective than anger or confrontation. And as she stormed off, muttering threats and excuses, humiliated beyond repair, I looked at the snowman, standing proud, innocent, unyielding, and I knew that this winter, the neighborhood had witnessed not just the fall of an entitled bully, but the triumph of patience, creativity, and the kind of justice that doesn't need to shout to be heard. And as I stepped back, watching children return to laugh at the snowman, neighbors murmuring about what had just occurred, and the faint glow of the winter sun reflecting off the perfect carrot nose, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that sometimes the most powerful lessons are hidden beneath layers of soft snow, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And this was that moment, the moment when entitlement collided with strategy, and the result was unforgettable. After the chaos of Karen's failed attempt to destroy my snowman, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers, laughter, and disbelief, a strange mix of relief and amusement that no one could quite contain, and I stood there, quietly observing from the edge of my driveway, heart still racing from the adrenaline, realizing that what had started as a simple act of winter fun had escalated into something much bigger, because suddenly, everyone was paying attention, everyone was noticing, and for the first time, Karen's reign of petty control over the street was not only challenged but publicly undermined, and as neighbors peeked from behind curtains, children giggled as they carefully circled the snowman, and adults shook their heads, exchanging knowing glances. I felt the satisfaction of silent triumph, the kind of triumph that doesn't need applause because the truth speaks for itself. While inside, Karen's mind must have been spinning in fury and disbelief, because here she was, confident, entitled, thinking that power could be asserted through recklessness. And now she was facing public humiliation for the first time in her life, and the absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on me, because the snowman, innocent, cheerful, perfectly sculpted, had become an unmovable symbol of clever strategy, a tangible reminder that patience and planning could outsmart brute force. And as I sipped my now cold coffee, watching her pacing back and forth near her crumpled SUV, shouting into her phone, presumably to someone who would reinforce her victim narrative, I felt a surge of quiet amusement, knowing full well that this time, there would be no sympathy for her, no blind loyalty, because witnesses had seen everything, neighbors had recorded, and even the children had become inadvertent storytellers of her arrogance. And as she muttered, gestured, and flailed, I began to imagine all the conversations she would have later, trying to rationalize her actions, spinning tales of danger and injustice, when in reality, the only danger had come from her own ego, driving recklessly into an ordinary snowman, and I could almost hear her thoughts. How could this happen? Why wasn't I obeyed? How could one quiet person outsmart me? And in that moment, it dawned on me just how powerful small acts of cleverness could be, how a little patience, creativity, and understanding of human psychology could topple the most arrogant of figures, because Karen's strength was only a perception, a carefully constructed illusion that crumbled the moment it collided with reality. And as the police arrived, calm and measured, asking questions and surveying the scene, I watched as she tried to assert control. Once more, attempting to turn the narrative in her favor, only to be met with questions that exposed her recklessness, her deliberate act, her own admission of intent, and slowly, her confidence drained away, replaced with panic, frustration, and the dawning realization that she had been outplayed in the simplest and most effective way, and neighbors, emboldened by the spectacle, began to share their experiences with her, recounting petty aggressions, past intimidation, and countless incidents where she had overstepped, and suddenly, the snowman was no longer just a snowman. It had become a catalyst for communal awareness, a symbol of resistance against entitlement, a trigger that revealed the absurdity of her behavior to everyone who had silently endured it for too long. And as I stood back, observing the unfolding consequences, the thrill of seeing justice delivered in such a creative, harmless, and undeniable way was intoxicating, because it wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. It was strategy, preparation, and a deep understanding of human behavior, showing that true power doesn't come from force or intimidation but from patience, cleverness, and the ability to foresee outcomes that others cannot. And as Karen continued to flail, shouting at anyone who would listen, I realized that the street had shifted, that the balance of power had changed permanently, and while she might continue to try to assert herself, the seeds of doubt, fear, and public scrutiny had been planted. The neighbors had witnessed the truth. The snowman stood firm, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive with laughter, relief, and the satisfaction of seeing an entitled bully humbled in a way that was fair, creative, and utterly satisfying. And I felt a calm pride knowing that I hadn't escalated, hadn't become angry, hadn't let my ego take control, but had simply outsmarted someone who underestimated the quiet determination of someone who refused to be intimidated. And as the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long, golden shadows across the icy street, children returned to play, neighbors murmured among themselves about what had just occurred, and the snowman, standing tall and proud, became more than snow. It became a lesson, a symbol, a story that would be retold in whispers and laughter for weeks to come, and Karen, realizing for the first time that her actions had consequences, her arrogance had limits, and her intimidation tactics could be outsmarted, finally retreated, muttering threats that rang hollow against the undeniable truth. And as I finally stepped inside, feeling the cold seeping from my gloves, the thrill of the day settling into a deep satisfaction, I knew that sometimes the smallest acts of creativity, patience, and strategic thinking could produce results far greater than brute force or anger ever could. And the snowman, simple and cheerful, remained the perfect testament to that truth, unshaken, unyielding, and triumphant. The next few days felt almost surreal, as the neighborhood slowly recovered from the spectacle of Karen's failed attack. The snowman standing tall in my yard like a silent sentinel, attracting curious glances, whispered conversations, and a growing sense of collective satisfaction among the neighbors who had long endured her petty rules and constant nagging. And I watched it all unfold with a quiet pride, knowing that what had seemed like a simple winter decoration had now become a symbol of resilience, cleverness, and the power of patience, because Karen, unwilling to accept defeat, escalated in ways that were both predictable and, in hindsight, almost comical, storming from house to house, sending frantic, passive-aggressive emails, attempting to call emergency HOA meetings, and even trying to pressure some neighbors into taking her side, as if anyone would defend someone who had deliberately driven into a snowman purely to assert dominance. And yet, despite her frantic energy, her power continued to crumble because the witnesses were many, the story was public, and the truth was undeniable. And I could see the tension building in her as she realized that no amount of complaining, no amount of manipulation, could erase what had happened, could undo the humiliation, could restore the illusion of control she had so carefully maintained. And it was during this period of escalating frustration that I noticed something remarkable. The community, previously silent or fearful, had begun to speak up, sharing stories of Karen's past overreach, recounting incidents of intimidation, absurd demands, and petty regulations enforced with an iron fist, and suddenly, the snowman became more than a symbol of my personal victory. It became the rallying point for a neighborhood long ready for change, and I, standing quietly in my yard, observing children returning to play, neighbors exchanging knowing glances, and Karen pacing and muttering by her damaged SUV, felt an unusual sense of satisfaction, the kind that comes not from confrontation but from knowing that preparation, intelligence, and patience had delivered justice without a single unnecessary blow. And as Karen continued to escalate, making phone calls to the HOA board, claiming danger, threatening lawsuits, and insisting on her victim narrative, the absurdity of it all reached a fever pitch because every step she took to assert herself only reinforced the fact that she had been outplayed, that her arrogance had blinded her to the simple reality that intentional recklessness has consequences, and the irony of the situation was not lost on me, because the very thing she had used to intimidate and control others, the perception of power, was now the source of her downfall, and I could almost see the wheels turning in her mind as she tried desperately to rewrite reality, failing to understand that her actions had been witnessed, recorded, and would be remembered for months. And as neighbors began to document the scene on their phones, sharing videos with other community members and even posting subtle hints on social media, the weight of public accountability settled over her like an invisible cage, and she began to look smaller, less imposing. The confidence that once radiated from her with every clipped word and polished glare now replaced with panic, disbelief, and simmering anger. And during this time, I noticed a subtle shift in the neighborhood dynamic, as people who had once avoided her, kept their heads down, and silently endured her petty tyrannies now stood a little taller, smiled a little more, and even children seemed emboldened to laugh freely, because the spectacle had exposed a truth everyone had known but been too intimidated to voice. That Karen's authority was built on fear, not respect, and that when confronted with cleverness, patience, and a refusal to be intimidated. Even the most self-assured bully could be brought low, and as I reflected on the unfolding events, I realized that the snowman, innocent and cheerful in appearance, had accomplished something extraordinary. It had turned fear into laughter, intimidation into humility, and arrogance into consequence. And it was then, as Karen fumed, sent frantic messages, and tried to rally support from the HO, that the police finally became involved in a more formal way, responding to her claims of hazards, reviewing evidence, and beginning a thorough investigation into the incident. And as the officer spoke with witnesses, reviewed videos, and observed the indestructible snowman standing proudly in my yard, Karen's frustration reached a peak, because for the first time, her actions were being scrutinized by impartial authority, and there was no narrative she could control, no excuse she could fabricate that would stand up to the overwhelming truth. And as I watched her stumble from one argument to another, flustered and red-faced, desperately trying to turn the story to her favor, I felt a calm certainty settle in me, the kind of certainty that comes from knowing the plan, executed flawlessly, had achieved exactly what I had envisioned. Not just the survival of the snowman, but a public, undeniable lesson in humility, patience, and strategic thinking. And by the time the week had passed, Karen's desperation had only intensified, with attempts to pressure neighbors failing, emails going unanswered, and the community collectively realizing that her authority could no longer dictate their lives. And as I walked past the snowman one evening, its carrot nose tilted just so, eyes sparkling in the fading light, scarf fluttering in the cold breeze, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, because the smallest act, building a snowman with care, joy, and a clever hidden reinforcement, had triggered a ripple effect that transformed a neighborhood, humbled a bully, and reminded everyone, including myself, that cleverness, patience, and calm determination can accomplish far more than anger, confrontation, or brute force ever could. And as I watched children play around it, neighbors exchanging approving glances, and Karen pacing like a caged lion, I knew that this was just the beginning of the lesson, and that the story of the snowman, the clever plan, and the fall of HOA Karen would be remembered, retold, and perhaps even whispered in awe for years to come, because it had become more than snow. It had become a symbol, a narrative, and a testament to the fact that even the quietest, most patient individual can change the balance of power when they refuse to be intimidated and choose strategy over anger. And in that moment, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long golden shadows across the street, I felt the thrill of victory, calm and quiet but infinitely satisfying, knowing that the snowman had won the day, and Karen, for all her bluster, had met her match. As the days passed, Karen's frustration and desperation reached levels that were almost painful to witness, the kind of desperation that comes when someone realizes their carefully constructed world of authority and intimidation is crumbling, and every step she took to regain control only highlighted her incompetence and arrogance, because the neighborhood had seen, recorded, and talked about what had happened, and the snowman, standing tall, cheerful, and completely unyielding, was the undeniable proof of her failure. And it was during this period of escalating tension that the HOA finally got involved formally, receiving multiple complaints, hearing first-hand accounts, and reviewing the overwhelming evidence captured on cameras and cell phones. And the irony wasn't lost on me that the very organization she used as a tool of power was now scrutinizing her, forcing her to face consequences for recklessness and harassment, because she had crossed a line, floored her SUV into a harmless snowman, and revealed her true nature to everyone, not just me. And as the officers spoke with witnesses, reviewed the footage, and asked questions, Karen's attempts to justify her actions became increasingly absurd. Her voice rising, hands waving, her composure completely shattered, and the neighbors, emboldened by this spectacle, began speaking freely about past grievances, from petty fines to unreasonable rules, from intimidation to absurd demands. And the snowman, innocent in appearance but fortified with clever design underneath, became more than a piece of art or winter fun. It had become the focal point of accountability, the symbol of a plan executed perfectly, and Karen, who had once ruled the street with an invisible fist of fear, suddenly found herself exposed, powerless, and humiliated, realizing too late that arrogance and entitlement can only take you so far, and that patience, strategy, And clever thinking can turn the tables in ways no one sees coming. And as I observed her stumbling through interviews, issuing frantic phone calls, and trying desperately to manipulate the narrative, I felt a deep satisfaction, knowing that my plan had worked flawlessly, because the combination of preparation, a simple snowman, and the unmovable post hidden beneath it had transformed a moment of potential conflict into an undeniable lesson. A lesson that was now unfolding publicly, for all to witness. And as the HOA deliberated, weighing the evidence, and the police documented the incident, Karen's demeanor changed from anger to panic, realizing that not only had she failed to assert dominance, she was now facing consequences that could affect her standing in the community, her credibility, and perhaps even her property and neighbors, who had been quietly enduring her petty tyranny for years, now spoke freely, recounting stories that revealed the pattern of behavior that had allowed fear to dominate for too long. And the more she attempted to justify herself, the more absurd she appeared, the narrative of power and intimidation crumbling around her like ice under the winter sun. While I stood quietly beside the snowman, observing the unfolding chaos, aware that this moment was the culmination of patience, intelligence, and a refusal to be intimidated, and that the very thing she had underestimated, my calmness, my preparation, and my understanding of human psychology, had rendered her powerless, because in her eyes, a snowman was an obstacle to conquer, a symbol of defiance to crush, yet in reality, it had been a vehicle for poetic justice, cleverly designed and executed with precision. And as the HOA issued warnings, citations, and formal reprimands, and the officers confirmed the reckless nature of her actions, Karen's fury gave way to resignation. Her attempts at intimidation now meaningless, and the street itself seemed to breathe, a collective exhale of relief, laughter, and satisfaction, because finally, the bully had been humbled, the snowman had survived, and the truth had been made evident for everyone to see. And as I looked at the children playing around it, neighbors chatting with renewed confidence, and the sun glinting off the carrot nose and sparkling eyes, I realized that what had begun as a simple act of winter joy had evolved into a full-scale lesson in accountability, patience, and clever resistance. And Karen, once the self-appointed ruler of the street, had been forced to confront the consequences of her arrogance, exposed not just to me, but to the entire community, and I felt a deep sense of quiet satisfaction knowing that the strategy, creativity, and calm determination had achieved exactly what I had hoped for. Not destruction, not revenge, but undeniable justice, and the neighborhood, having witnessed the fall of entitlement in real time, had found its voice again. Laughter returned, joy returned, and the snowman, once just a playful winter decoration, had become a lasting symbol of resilience, clever planning, and the power of standing firm, while Karen, humiliated and powerless, finally realized that her reign of intimidation was over, and in that moment, I knew that sometimes, the smallest acts, performed with patience and intelligence, can ripple outward to create consequences far larger than anyone anticipates, and that joy, strategy, and clever thinking can triumph over arrogance and aggression. And the snowman remained, innocent, cheerful, and unshakable, a reminder that justice can be subtle, silent, and devastatingly effective when executed with precision, patience, and an unwavering refusal to be intimidated. And as the day ended, neighbors returned to their homes smiling, children playing around the snowman, the sun setting behind the rooftops, and Karen, for all her bluster, had finally met the limits of her power. By the final days of that unforgettable winter, Karen's attempts to reclaim authority had completely unraveled. Her frantic phone calls, emails, and HOA complaints now met with polite but firm refusals, her credibility in shambles, and the neighborhood watching with a mix of awe and satisfaction as the once feared ruler of the street had been reduced to muttering threats and pacing aimlessly around her crumpled SUV, and I, standing beside the snowman that had become far more than a simple winter decoration, felt a deep, quiet triumph, because this towering figure of snow, cheerful, innocent, yet secretly fortified with clever design, had outsmarted arrogance, taught a lesson, and reminded everyone that patience, creativity, and calm strategy can overcome even the most entitled of bullies. And as the sun cast long, golden shadows across the street, children returned to play freely around it, Neighbors exchanging stories and laughs about Karen's meltdown, the videos and photos, spreading across social media and local community boards like wildfire, cementing the snowman's place as a symbol of justice and cleverness, while Karen, desperate and flustered, tried one last time to regain control, only to face polite but firm resistance from everyone she approached. Neighbors shaking their heads, smiling knowingly, and quietly rejoicing that her reign of intimidation was finally over. And as the HOA reviewed the situation, issuing formal reprimands, citations, and a clear record of her reckless behavior, Karen's options dwindled further, leaving her exposed, powerless, and humiliated, unable to spin a narrative, unable to intimidate, and finally forced to confront the undeniable truth that her arrogance had blinded her to consequences, and the street, once silent under the weight of her petty rules, was now alive with laughter, chatter, and a renewed sense of freedom. A community reminded that collective awareness and courage, paired with clever planning, can triumph over entitlement and fear, and I watched quietly as children carefully circled the snowman, sculpted by my hands but transformed by events into something greater than myself, a symbol of resilience, strategy, and the power of patience, while neighbors smiled at each other knowingly, a silent camaraderie forming in the shared memory of witnessing an entitled bully humbled by her own mistakes, and Karen, finally resigning herself to the reality of the situation, packed up, sold her house, and moved away, leaving the neighborhood forever changed, the snowman standing as a lasting reminder of what can happen when arrogance meets cleverness, patience, and subtle but effective resistance. And as I walked past it one last time that winter, feeling the cold in my gloves, the satisfaction in my chest, and the joy of knowing that no harm had come to anyone and justice had been served in the most creative and harmless way possible, I realized that the snowman had achieved something extraordinary. It had brought the community together, exposed entitlement, and taught a lesson that words alone could never have conveyed, and I knew that for years to come, its story would be retold in whispers, in laughter, and in admiration for the simple but brilliant plan that turned a playful winter decoration into a symbol of triumph, because Karen's attempt to destroy joy had backfired spectacularly, teaching her, and everyone who witnessed it, that sometimes the smallest acts, done with intelligence, patience, and a little creativity, can ripple out to create consequences far beyond what anyone expects, and that true power does not come from aggression or intimidation, but from cleverness, preparation, and the unwavering refusal to be intimidated. And as the sun finally set behind the rooftops, casting the street in soft, fading light, I stood quietly, watching the snowman glisten, children laughing around it, neighbors chatting freely, and knowing that the story had come full circle, from a simple act of winter joy to an unforgettable lesson in humility, justice, and the enduring power of clever strategy. And in that moment, I understood that the snowman, innocent and cheerful in appearance, would forever stand as the unshakable proof that even the most entitled, arrogant, and fearless bullies can be humbled when patience, creativity, and subtle planning meet their audacity, and the neighborhood, once silent under fear, now thrived under laughter and shared awareness, while Karen, for all her bluster, had finally learned the hard truth. That joy cannot be destroyed by recklessness, arrogance, or entitlement, and that sometimes, the quietest victories are the most powerful, leaving the snowman and the story of that winter as a lasting testament to cleverness, patience, and the triumph of calm intelligence over hubris.